Musical Talk, the UK's independent musical theatre podcast. Hello, and welcome to another edition of Musical Talk. I'm Thos, and I think that when it comes to discussing the work of the late Stephen Sondheim, it's much better to be one of the wise guys than one of the assassins. It's better company, after all, and it avoids the follies of the latter. I mean, after all, we all want to bounce forward rather than end up at square one. Now, I know that this introduction is little more than a sideshow for the main episode, and I can tell that the natives are restless, so it's probably time to get this show on the road. Or in other words, a road show. And if you're thinking, what's the old man done? Has he finally gone off his trolley? You wouldn't be far off, but the answer is that I've been riffing on a number of Stephen Sondheim musical titles, including a number of working titles. And I'm not going to insult your intelligence or waste your time by telling you what they all were. If you're interested, it's very easy to find out. But it does take us very nicely to what we're going to be talking about today, which is the late Stephen Sondheim's last musical show. Now, at one level, I have to put speech marks around that statement because who knows, there may well be further shows in his trunk just waiting to come out. And after all, Fred Ebb seemed to be writing shows well after his death because there were 3 or 4 Kander and Ebb shows in development, including the masterful Scottsboro Boys. But for all intents and purposes, the last Sondheim show has happened. And that's a very sad thing to have to report. It is, of course, Here We Are, which for a while was known as Square One, which I've already mentioned. And its plot derives from 2 films directed by Louis Buñuel, that's The Exterminating Angel and The Discreet Charm of the Bourgeoisie, made in the 1960s and the 1970s. But in this musical, updated to either now or perhaps sometime in the future. There's a debate to be had on that, and you'll hear some of that conversation in the recording that you're about to hear, because when it was announced that the show, Here We Are, was finally going to be produced, and it opened at the Shed in New York City on the 22nd of October 2023, my fellow presenter here on Musical Talk, Colm Malloy, immediately got to action and booked himself a flight to New York. And not only that, he booked himself tickets to see Here We Are twice. Now that is dedication. Someone living in London, so keen to see the last Sondheim show that he flew to New York to see it. Some of us, however, are waiting for it to come to London and indeed the rest of the world. And there is a recording looming later this year, I believe. It's already been recorded, so we know there's going to be a CD or an album to stream, depending on choice. And so that's something to look forward to. But Here We Are has opened and closed. Because, as I say, it opened on the 22nd of October last year and then closed on the 21st of January this year. Now, that doesn't sound terribly long for a Stephen Sondheim show, but it was an extended run. It was originally going to close on the 7th of January, so in that sense it's been successful. But is the show itself a success? Well, that's really what we're going to be discussing today. A number of the reviews have been quite negative, and some people have gone on to say that it is in fact a failure. A number of other people have said that it's pretentious and they don't really understand the plot and the narrative. And Wikipedia, though not an unimpeachable source, does have an interesting phrase for this. It says, reviews were positive, if largely restrained. I suspect that, as with so many Stephen Sondheim shows, it's going to take a few years for us to finally work out its worth, value, and hidden meanings and depth. And at the very end of today's episode, I'll give you a brief idea of the show in the Sondheim catalogue that I think it's most like. And it might very well, therefore, have a similar legacy to that one. So do stay around until the end and see if you agree with me. But I know you must be burning to hear about the conversation on Here We Are. It's a show for which there's been so much anticipation. It was first announced in February 2012, so it's taken over a decade to create. And there is a question as to whether it is in fact finished. And that question and a lot more will come up in the conversation you're about to hear with me and the excellent Colm Malloy, talking about Here We Are, which has a book by David Ives and music and lyrics by the late Stephen Sondheim. I do hope you enjoy this fascinating conversation. Musical Talk. Colm.
Thos.
Good to see you.
Is it?
It's always good to see you.
That's nice.
It's also good to hear you and to hear from you.
That's very generous. 3 compliments in 10 seconds.
Absolutely. The invoice will follow in the post. But you've done something which actually I admire very strongly. And that was the moment that it was announced that the new, and indeed possibly last, but certainly for the time being, last expected Stephen Sondheim musical was going to open on Broadway. You booked tickets. Not just to go to New York, but to go and see the show. And you went to see the show twice when you were there. I suppose, why would you not?
Glutton for punishment.
Well, not at all, because I know that you enjoyed it. But we're talking about Here We Are, the last Stephen Sondheim musical. I think we have to call it that. It's my privilege to be talking to somebody who went to see it and see it twice, almost immediately upon opening. So I suppose before we get on to anything else, what did you know about Here We Are before it finally manifested? Because this is the Sondheim that's sort of been on and off for 10 years, and many of us thought that it was actually been shelved, and there was this new show coming along which was a different source material, which I'm going to call Square One just to separate it. And then it turned out that Here We Are, which is also Square One, is also the original thing that Sondheim was talking about maybe 10 years ago, which was to take 2 films which are called The Exterminating Angel and The Discreet Charm of the Bourgeoisie, 2 films from the 60s and 70s, and turn them into a musical. That's what I understand about it. That's very high level. I just know it's metamorphosed in a way that I don't think most of us realised it was still going on. Most of us thought it had been shelved.
Sure.
You may know better. But what did you know and what drove you?
Going into the show, once I bought my tickets, I knew that it was based on those 2 films. I had read the Variety article that I think was written by Frank Rich, in which he interviewed David Ives, Joe Mantello, the director, and maybe one other person. It must be Alexander Gemignani, the MD, to talk about the writing process.
And David Ives here is the writer of the book.
Yes. And the overwhelming takeaway from that is, heads up, there are not many songs in the second act. In fact, they trail off quite early on.
So you knew that before you went in?
Sure, and the thrust of the article is that they had presented a dramaturgical concession in the plot to Sondheim, who effectively signed off the work he had done up until that point, as if to say, this can go ahead. I don't know how true that is. And knowing the films, I had seen them once, I think as soon as I'd heard about the project, so I hadn't seen them for about 9-10 years. But surrealism and absurdism isn't alien to me. I know what to expect. I know what the tropes are, at least. So,
and those 2 films sort of... Well, we'll talk about the films in a minute, but yeah, they're not standard linear plots.
Sure.
Yeah, and nor is Here We Are.
So I don't think I was too concerned with that news, even despite the fact it was picked up by newspapers like the New York Post, where people like Michael Riedel said, "Newsflash, Sondheim musical has no songs," which, again...
Yeah. A slightly exaggerated position, presumably to sell copy.
Sure, but also, again, if you know what the source material is, it's kind of not surprising. So if you're going to see a musical based on those 2 films, I don't really want to necessarily see a straightforward musical.
Yeah. Now, this is quite interesting, because I think there's a couple of threads we need to start pulling on here. There's the source films and how that can be turned, or those can be turned into a solitary plot. And we'll talk about the source material in just a minute. And then we will talk about this as a musical and its success, or otherwise as a stage piece. And I think we do then need to talk about how far is this Schubert's Unfinished Symphony, or how far is it a complete musical that just happens to be able to riff on the material it has in such a way that actually not putting songs in for the last 2/3 of Act 2, which is essentially what you get, incidental music, but you don't get songs per se, as we understand them. Does that affect it as a piece? You know, we have to look at it as a piece. It's quite difficult to separate the fact we know that Sondheim died before it was produced from our understanding of it. But we can only do it justice on what it is, not what it might have been. So I think there's a number of little strands here for us to look at. But can we start actually with the narrative, which is always my safe place to go to?
Sure, the narrative of the musical.
Yes, and how it relates to those films. Now, you and I have seen the films together very recently as we're recording this. You very sensibly said, let's watch them in the order that they appear in the musical. It's because they actually appear... The first film is The Exterminating Angel, which I think is 1967. In terms of the chronological order of it.
Got you.
And then the second film is The Discreet Charm of the Bourgeoisie, which I think is 72, 73, 74, something like that.
There's 10 years between them.
Yes,
really.
Yeah. So one's in black and white and one's in colour. But we watched The Discreet Charm first, because that forms essentially Act 1 of Here We Are. And then we watched The Exterminating Angel, which essentially forms Act 2. And for me, that was terribly interesting as an exercise, because you had told me, that each act represents the two films. They don't overlap usually, except that in the films there's no overlap at all, except for the director, who's Louis Brunel.
It's the only thing that unites them.
And indeed, even in terms of their genre, and I want to talk about that, they're not absolutely the same. They share some tropes, but I think if we were describing them, we'd use different terms. But when you had told me that as we watched the films, the two films formed the musical, I was trying to map the characters from The Discreet Charm, Act 1, over the characters of The Exterminating Angel, Act 2.
Sure.
And whilst the characters in the films don't match at all, I could see how you might do it. And indeed, it worked terribly well, I think, seeing the stage version. So I was really pleased to see the films and to get an understanding of the context of the story as I understand it on stage. But, and this is the point I want to make here, and you've mentioned the word abstract and surreal, these films are not... They are typical of a form of filmmaking in terms of its speech marks narrative, storytelling, that was common, or at least common enough to be known in the 60s and 70s, and has died, or at least diminished, so sufficiently that people don't... You don't see abstract films looking at concepts in an abstract way. You don't see films which are using abstraction as a way of actually drawing back to make satirical points. Now, the two films, from the 60s and 70s appear to me to be terribly satirical, observational about various things that were wrong in society. It's very class-based.
Sure.
But they do it in such a strange way. But if I would argue that The Exterminating Angel is an abstractionist, absurdist science fiction film, whereas The Discreet Charm is oddly more rambling. It's much less compact as a story and goes off in a lot more tangential ways and is more absurdist. I would say the absurdist flavours are in The Discreet Charm, and then there's a much tighter plot, even though it's absurdist as well, in The Exterminating Angel. But together, married together, they make an absurdist, satirical observation on society as was, which also then is reflected on the society as is in the stage version, but we'll get onto that in a minute. How would you describe the films?
I think you've done a very good job.
Oh.
I think you're right in that the Discreet Charm lends itself to things like dream sequences, dreams within dreams. The rug is constantly pulled in terms of one's expectations about where it's heading. Scenes are quite brief. There's no kind of unity of space or time, whereas compared to The Exterminating Angel, it all takes place within one space. And you're right, it feels like the danger is more of a supernatural quality rather than the whim of a director. It feels almost like there is this external presence or external force.
Yes, you're right. That's what makes it more science fiction for me.
Sure, I can buy that, yeah.
Whereas the first one is... I mean, when we were talking about it when we watched it, we kept using the word random. But I think random is too strong a word. I like your idea that it's for directors... take
whims.
Yes, exactly. But it's not quite as neat as that. There are purely absurdist moments in The Exterminating Angel. There's in the film we get sheep and a bear turn up.
Sure.
We get sheep and a bear in the stage play as well, but the sheep are in a different act. So the flavours are still there. And I use the word flavour ironically because they get eaten in the film, which they don't in the stage version.
Although the cast do become barring sheep at one point in the second act.
They do. I'd forgotten that.
Sorry to pick up on that.
No, you're absolutely right. And so you're on a stage play. Yes, it's got, almost, if you like, an homage to the film is made. Yes, I'd forgotten about that. Yes, they're forced by a character who... There is no obvious avatar in either of the films, actually, funny enough. I thought that was the biggest deviation from the films, which is, and here's a spoiler, we will be talking spoilers here, the butler character in the embassy, Windsor, as he's called.
A.K.A. Inferno.
Inferno, absolutely, yes, quite. So I think the films were wonderful. I hadn't seen them before, so I watched them for the first time with you literally a few days ago, and when we watched them more or less back to back, and I really appreciated them. I found them hugely entertaining. I found them hugely pointed. I think there's a real pointed satire in them, which still holds today. And actually, this is a sign of a good piece of work, or two good pieces of work. I have spent a lot of time thinking about those films, partly because you have to. You know, if you just lie back and take them, which you can do with absurdism, you can just say, oh, this is highly entertaining but odd. I can't really frame it in any way or connect it. I can't see the golden threads. And then you can leave the auditorium where it is being shown and not think of it again. But I think those of us who are interested in thinking about what we've seen, you know, I've tried desperately to try and make links and connections between the films through the director, you know, see if I can identify Louis Brunel's particular tastes and themes and interests and overlaps. I'm trying to make sense of what I had seen and heard, you know, the actual, I'm going to use the word narrative, but, you know, how do you make sense of it? And you've been very wise all the way through this. You counselled me to be careful not to make too many links. You can, and this is the great thing, you can actually impose as an audience member almost what you like on them. So when I've been looking for threads and connections, they are as right or as wrong as anyone else's would be, and you don't have to do that at all. There will be a question, therefore, when you see it on stage. Can the science fiction, the absurdism, the randomness, the satire survive in the 21st century stage adaptation of these two films? I think that's quite a big question. What was your experience of seeing it in the theatre, and what did you understand to be the experience of the people you were seeing it with, the other members of the audience?
I was kind of into it from the very beginning. It may not be surprising, but absurdism and surrealism is kind of my bag. It's rom-com to me in the way that it is to people who like rom-com.
Yeah.
That's a really useful analogy there, wasn't
Catnip.
it? Yes, sure, it's catnip to me. So anything that seems illogical or arbitrary, for me, I find kind of quite liberating, and I've always found it a really interesting forum to see characters explore themselves psychologically, because nothing makes sense.
Yes.
The characters are almost completely isolated from the constraints of a plot to bring them along. They have to completely examine themselves.
Exist in their own right, almost.
Well, and I think it's quite powerful in that sense. I forgot what your question was, is what did I make of it going into it? I think I was quite nervous. This remains, and will only be really, the first and last time I encounter a new Sondheim. I was a bit too young when the Roadshow came out, and I was kind of probably not even thought of before the other ones came out. So, yeah, I was quietly nervous, and I think I went in with low expectations, because again, I thought, well, it might not be finished. We don't know what state it's going to be in. And I think that's always the best way. And I wound up being quite surprised, pleasantly, because not only is it visually very, really, I think, stunning production, the cast are incredibly strong. From a performance perspective, I think it's incredibly strong. And I think the material holds up. Sure, we're getting Sondheim imitating Sondheim, but I'd rather he imitate himself than anyone else, to a degree. Yeah. So there are bits of that. And yet, I think that's me being mean, I think I was really quite moved by how creative and clever some of the dramatic song moments were, and the levels of meta that went on in order to give the song additional meaning. Does that answer your question?
Oh, it does. And you've raised so many things I'd like to discuss there as well. So just briefly, let's put one on the table. You said Sondheim imitating Sondheim. Now, I'd just like to unpack that, because this is Sondheim literally at the end of his career. Can Sondheim do anything other than sound like Sondheim? Well, not according to this. He sounds exactly like Sondheim. It's, anyone hearing it who knows anything of a Sondheim musical would say, well, that's clearly a Sondheim song.
Sure.
I think it is orchestrated by Jonathan Tunick as well, isn't it? I believe.
Is.
So that also adds to that Sondheim flavour. They go together like peaches and cream, and not like a wholesome marriage. And so,
in the case of a surrealist film, they go together like peaches and avocado.
yes, like Queen Victoria and a horse.
Yeah.
Now, would you say he was imitating? There were certain moments where I thought he was almost inversing some of his own songs, and sometimes where he was almost riffing on some previous ideas. And indeed, fun enough, there's a lot of incidental music in it as well, isn't there? Now, I don't know if he wrote that or whether it was extrapolated from his songs by Tunick and others, but after I finished being aware of it, I suddenly realised that I had Country House from the 1987 version of Follies running around my head. Now, I don't quite know why. I'm guessing there may be a bit of incidental music or something like that which just has triggered off a memory. Don't know. But it's interesting that I know what you mean by Sondheim imitating Sondheim. But do you think he is pastiching himself, or is he just writing Sondheim because it sounds like Sondheim?
I think more the latter. I think any associations people make who really know a composer's work. I think I've always...
As you do.
Well, yeah, but I think I've always bristled at this idea that a composer can become self-derivative. That sounds like a line from an absurdist play,
yes.
To be quite honest. What else is a composer supposed to do?
Funny enough, I've had this conversation with someone else, Josh Clark of this parish, about Andrew Lloyd Webber. Andrew Lloyd Webber is sometimes accused of pastiching others' music, but actually we'd seen Sunset Boulevard together, not a score I knew particularly well, but it was absolute Andrew Lloyd Webber all the way through. And over the years, I've realised there is an absolutely archetypal Andrew Lloyd Webber sound and an Andrew Lloyd Webber song, or at least there are a number of songs which are Andrew Lloyd Webberish within his catalogue. What else can they be? It's absolutely true of Sondheim. Sondheim is, in my opinion, the better composer, and obviously he's a lyricist as well. But neither of them can be denied as great musical writers. And so, you can send yourself up, I suppose, but I didn't get that impression at all with Here We Are.
No, I think if there were ever a moment where Sondheim was sending himself up, it would be in God, in Sondheim or Sondheim.
Yeah.
But anyway, I think there are I hear bits of passion. I hear it in the soldier song or in the motif that accompanies what the soldier sings. That kind of is it. I hear bits of passion, maybe bits of Into the Woods, but you could really pinpoint that to just how the music is arpeggiated, and Sondheim doesn't have carte blanche on arpeggios in music. So
they arrived before he did.
They did.
Well, I suppose, do you think it's quite difficult to know this because we know the answer already, but could you say that if you didn't know from where it came, if you heard the score or some of the songs from Here We Are, it would be recognised as late Sondheim rather than early
That's
Sondheim?
a good question.
I'll ignore the implied statement about all the other questions.
Except you won't. That I don't know, because I think you can hear, again, little bits of Roadshow and Bounce in there.
Yeah, late era Sondheim.
It has a sparseness to it that I think Bounce and Roadshow and bits of Passion have. I think Sondheim's work gets leaner as he gets older, but I think given the subject material and given the playfulness of it, it feels earlier. Because I think Sondheim's work gets more serious.
Oh, yes.
But I think this feels...
It's a comedy,
lean,
isn't it, ultimately?
Yeah, sure.
Or certainly a comedy is one of the ways you can describe it.
Sure. Would you agree? Or
I would, but I think this is fascinating about Sondheim, because as you know, Sondheim over the years has revisited shows and plopped songs in and taken songs out. We've just mentioned Follies. I mean, Follies 87 is not Follies
71.
Yeah, exactly. I love both, but they're very different shows. Saturday Night, when that was revived, he added 2 songs. I once asked Tim if he could tell, and he guessed one, but he couldn't guess the other, and I thought that was quite interesting. So Sondheim is relatively good, I think, at being able to put himself back in how he sounded in his historic times and plug himself in. Not seamlessly, because, as I say, one of those songs from Saturday Night, Tim could spot as being the modern, because it felt different enough to feel more sophisticated, actually. And, Saturday Night is the original Sondheim, if you like, words and music.
Text.
Yes. Yeah. But he can do that, and he can time travel back to where he was. If I heard this score and I didn't know it's from Here We Are. I think I would recognise it as late Sondheim, exactly for the reason you say. It's leaner. There's less of it.
It's fragmentary.
It's fragmentary. Yes, you're right.
That's the big characteristic, I think.
Slightly more tessellated pavement, isn't it, in that sense? Which I think fits the absurdist plot brilliantly.
Totally.
Yeah.
I think it's a huge quality of the show, of the music.
Yeah. But I agree with you, because the piece is at least infused with a genuine comedy, which Roadshow and Passion are not. Even Assassins has got a dark humour in it. The later shows are much less humorous, much more straight-laced, po-faced possibly. I'm going to put my cards on my table. On the table. I don't much like Roadshow, and I certainly don't like Passion. I don't buy Passion for what it's trying to do. I don't buy the passion, essentially. But I like all the shows up to Assassins, and I do like Here We Are. And then there was a question about whether, is this late Sondheim imitating Sondheim? Is it pastiche Sondheim? And I'll tell you why I think it isn't. Because I think the bits that have got the songs in, i.e. the bits that have got the Sondheim flourish, are better than the sequence in Act 2 that doesn't. I actually think that it loses its way a bit in Act 2, or at least it's not polished up enough to match the sheen of Act 1 and the beginning of Act 2.
Oh, sure.
I think you miss Sondheim when he's not performing, as it were, in Act 2.5.
You can't say, Sondheim is being derivative and then go, we all missed his songs in Act 2.
Exactly.
Which is it?
Yeah, he's legitimately improving this show with his presence. It's collaborative,
Totally.
But so I'm not in any way criticising it, and it held its own in Act 2. But I thought, I'm not enjoying this as much. And a song would tie a few things together or emphasise a point, and do the things that songs do. Why music? This is why musicals are good. They do more than a narrative piece. Yeah.
So what you're saying is you can see it in the 60s on a triple bill with Anyone Can Whistle and Evening Primrose.
Yes, I probably could. Yeah, but it's more sophisticated than those. It's late. It's late. Well, I tell you what. Yes, it's late Sondheim. It's mature Sondheim structuring with earlier Sondheim tonality, maybe.
Yeah.
But there's a point. You said something to me when you came back from New York about what you'd overheard. You said many things, indeed. But you'd heard what the audience had said, or some members of the audience. You wandered around in the interval when you saw it on stage with your ears wagging.
Well, I've also not been afraid to read the reviews, which echo similar thoughts.
So do you want to just sort of clarify what seems to have been, at least, if not the majority, I don't know, can't tell you the proportion, but some of the things that people are saying about it?
But there's an air of pretension to the thing. The reviews aren't favourable. You can go looking for a number of video essays on YouTube. People aren't clamouring about the show, but then again, it depends who your circle is. Loads of people are raving about it. I don't know if this show is destined for Broadway. I'd love to see it on Broadway, but then...
it's off-Broadway at the moment.
It's off-Broadway at the moment. But then... that comes with baggage. I only really want to see it on Broadway because I want more people to see it. Ideally, I think it should stay in that venue for another year. They should make another shed to put that show in, because I think putting that into a Broadway space will detract on so many levels. But
to give a British audience of this programme some sense, where would you place it if you were taking it to London? What is the ideal venue in London?
The space it feels most similar to is the Littleton in the National.
Interesting.
It's that kind of... Well, Littleton is still quite big. It's about a 400, 500...
The Biggleton.
The shed is about a 400, 500 seat space. So maybe somewhere like the Young Vic.
The Menier? The Donmar?
Yeah, they're quite snug, those places.
Yes.
And it's quite an expanse being in the shed and seeing it there. How the second act set comes in... That's why I thought of the Littleton, because you've got a huge space behind the stage of the Littleton.
We should say that the staging, it's white box for Act 1. This is an illuminated box. It's sparse in terms of its props, and such props as there are in fact actually sets. They come down from the ceiling, so they go to a number of restaurants in Act 1, and each restaurant has sort of seating which sort of descends from the gods and comes back up again. It descends from the flies. And disappears again when not needed. But beyond that, it's actually sparse, magnificent. But Act 2...
It's the complete opposite.
Yeah, it becomes a drawing room piece.
Yeah.
And the white stage at the beginning opens up in Act 2, this is. And there's a kind of this drawing room at the back where the show's going to take place in that act. And then it sort of glides forward to take over the white box. Or the white square, we should say. I think we need to talk about resonances of previous titles in just a minute. But,
sure.
Yes, very impressive space, the shed. I don't know if you could stage it the same way, but in a way that's not the problem. You know, any clever director will be able to come up with something. I just wondered if you thought the size was useful. I'm just thinking that the Donmar is now quite a Sondheim-y place.
Sure.
You know, I'm thinking of Passion, funny enough, and things like that. So let's address some of these comments about pretension. You see, when you told me, you came back from New York and you said you'd heard people say it was pretentious, and then you said, and it's some of the reviews had said the same thing as well. And we had a really interesting conversation on that occasion, which is actually, and this alludes to what we were saying earlier, that in the 60s and 70s, art films, particularly in my head European art films, were a known commodity. They were known to be this sort of absurdist thing. I mean, but it was known enough in mainstream culture, for mainstream culture to make fun of it. So, and I think I may have told you this, there was I remember a sketch show on BBC Two, I think it was, in the early 1980s, and one of the sketches was they decided to do a French film. So it was someone sitting under a tree in black and white, a beautiful girl turns up on a bicycle, they sit down together, and then one of them covers themselves in teaspoons from a basket. You know, and my father sat there roaring because he'd seen French films in the 60s and 70s, and whilst they weren't quite as crude as that, you know, that surrealist, artistic, is this meaningful, is it not meaningful, what am I not understanding here, was understood. It was much more of a lexicon of films, and people saw them. People may not have gone to art films very much like now, but they went enough to get the joke even in the 80s. I can't remember the last time I saw an absurdist film. I can't remember a new one. I can't remember the last time I saw anything quite so figurative, let's say, rather than narrative. It's not common. It's sort of really fallen out of the lexicon, and it's certainly fallen out of what I'm going to call commercial theatre, which, let us be honest, is what dominates the West End of Broadway now, and indeed off-Broadway to a degree, as we've seen. So is pretension, as people call it, a failure of understanding on their part, because is it an art form that's actually died out in the last 30 years that we're seeing with Here We Are, which isn't therefore pretentious, it's just misunderstood?
It's definitely fallen out of favour or out of fashion, really.
Yeah.
And as you've suggested, these things do come back, and the pendulum swings around. And just because something is, say, out of fashion or not understood, it doesn't necessarily mean anything to do with the quality of the work.
No, of course
I think
not.
you'd probably agree. And I think, again, the general consensus is that the show is quite refreshing to watch. There's nothing really like it.
I agree with that, yeah.
Which makes it, if you're a curious person, it makes it a curious show to watch. If you're not curious, and if you want to go out and have a good evening...
If you're intellectually stultified, yes.
Then you're going to find it hard to watch.
Yeah.
The answer to the question of what are you going to the theatre for, it's what food are you looking for when you go to the supermarket?
Yes. Well, in a theatre, food for thought. But do you know, it's interesting. I've been trying to, in my head, work out what I think is its closest relative in musical theatre. Do you have an answer? I have one. I don't think it's a perfect match at all. I don't think they're brothers. I think they're, they're cousins, perhaps once or even twice removed. But shall I give you my option?
Can you give me a clue
as to what I'm thinking?
Well, yeah.
Oh, right. It would be the apple of my eye.
Thinking of the apple tree?
No. That's far too clever an answer.
Oh, you're thinking of something like Pippin or Godspell.
I'm thinking Pippin. Yes. Yeah. Which, as you know, is an apple.
Yeah.
So
those kind of
existentialists
troupe of actors being in a musical, very much like the kind of thing we see at the Fringe sometimes.
Actually, that's true. Yes, we are now going to, here are actors. We'll sing a song, and now we're going to, in front of you, assume the characters that will be playing in the piece. Dead Man's Suitcase was the show we saw this last summer.
Although there isn't that kind of, oh God, is there that in Here We Are? There's moments of the fourth wall being broken, but the characters never become the actors, but the characters definitely realise their characters in Here We Are. So,
and indeed in the film.
Sure.
There's a coup de théâtre, which is actually a lift from the film.
Yeah.
Do we want to talk about it?
Sure, go.
I think we ought. Yeah, in the film, and I think it's stronger in a film because it's a media mashup. There's this odd moment where they're having dinner and suddenly the world changes and they're in an audience on a stage. Turns out someone's having a dream, or at least that's what we're being invited to think. Someone falls asleep and has a dream and thinks that the dinner party they're having is entirely artificial, it's a stage play. And on the film, we see the scenery drop away. We've been given clues up to that point because the scenery is suddenly not film style realistic. They're not in a room that's got real paintings on the walls. They've got a wall which is painted to look like there's a painting on it, like a set, like a flat.
Yeah.
And then suddenly they disappear, and you see the audience in the theatre or watching them on the stage. And this causes a great deal of disconnect for the characters themselves. That is attempted in Here We Are, successfully at one point, but I don't think they make a meal of it. In fact, I think it's over too soon. I think it's a moment in Act 1.
Yeah.
So how did it come across in the audience?
It was very funny.
Yes, the audience laugh with it, don't they?
Totally. I think what a lot of this show is doing is pulling at these tropes that we come to expect in musicals as well. That's not a thing we've not ever seen before. I think we've all been to a show in which the characters become aware that they're in a show.
Yeah.
And it becomes a bit boring. Similarly, and in that moment, or that exact moment, but a couple of moments earlier, two characters are holding a note for a very long time. That's a trope that we see done a lot in musicals. And so when those things did happen, I thought, normally I'd be like mildly infuriated by this. But actually I think there's an additional meaning. And I think what it's doing is actually pulling apart on, isn't this a bit ridiculous that this happens in musicals?
So here's
We're making a psychological virtue of it instead.
I totally agree with that point. I'm interested in people's responses. So I'm going to ask that stupid question. And it is a stupid question. Are people giving it the right response? When I saw it in the film, that moment I actually found quite shocking. Even though by then I was absolutely immersed in the absurdism of it all, because it felt like someone had pulled the world even as it was, that strange world that we're seeing where things don't work the way I understand them. It felt like the seams had been pulled apart and it went even further. So I actually found it quite shocking in the film, but I also recognised the film was 50 years ago. What was shocking then may not be shocking now, although it was shocking to me. I'd not seen the film before, and I don't see that kind of thing in film at all these days. On stage, it's really interesting to me that people laughed. Now, I think there's two reasons for this. I think, first of all, they're in a theatre, so that the power of the format change, the media change, which you see in the film, from film to theatre, even though it's a film of the theatre, telling you that the film is theatre, cannot be done in a theatre. The theatre is saying, but we're in a theatre, exactly as you say. It could be a cliche, it could be overdone. They turn up the house lights and everyone starts laughing, self-consciously of course, because suddenly I'm in this, because that's had the reverse effect. It brings the audience onto the stage almost, rather than necessarily making the stage come into the audience, although it probably does both. So I can understand that the lights and the realisation of, look, let's look at everybody in a room. It's not two sets of people. It's not an audience and a cast. It's all of us in a room, with half of us pretending to be a cast and half of us being asked to realise there's a pretense. But there's also people laughing at it because, is it a laugh of shock? I'm not sure it is. I think it's a laugh of humour. And is that people misunderstanding the point of it? But I don't want to sound judgmental. But
I think in the film there's a more intentional climax to that moment. I think where it occurs in the musical, it's still quite early on. And in fact, that moment is then, I would use the word, undermined by an even greater climax very shortly afterwards, which is the train coming through in the song, which, if you're in the theatre, is so loud and arresting that I found that quite frightening, but not in a I was actually frightened, but it startled me. What I mean to say is, I think all of these moments build up to a greater climax, which is in Act 2, which is the bear dance.
Yes.
For me, I think these moments become increasingly absurd and more surreal as they go along. Because I definitely know when I was in the audience, the dance with the bear, those laughs were not amusement. They were kind of a bit like,
what is this
shock, bemusement laughs.
That's really, and of course, because you're in the auditorium, you'd have got that sense of the feeling, which, unless you're there, you're not going to get that. Funny enough, I've got to just mention this, and it seems it will be so obvious to everyone, I imagine. But you talk about the scene where it's mentioned that a train is coming at them, as it were, and you get the light show and the sound show, and what you get is a theatrical convention of what a train is, and the cast sort of cower to avoid it. There's the famous story of the cinema in France at the end of the 19th century where they show a black and white film of a steam locomotive coming straight towards the cameraman, and therefore the audience sitting in that auditorium, who fled and screamed, because it looked realistic. And actually, this is the theatrical antithesis of this, but playing the same game. Yeah. But interestingly, not with the audience in this case, but with the cast. I do quite like... There's a lot of inversions of well-known tropes. Mm. I mentioned this briefly in the score, and I'm going to have to touch on it. The first sort of song in it is called, This Is a Beautiful Day, sung by Marianne, who's the slightly ditzy wife of Leo.
Yeah.
Who's a self-made businessman and not a terribly nice piece of work. Funny enough, Marianne is just sort of ditzy, charming, probably quite irritating.
Very happy with life.
Very happy with life. Turning a blind eye to the nastiness, that she's sort of willfully ignorant. Ignorance is bliss for her. And bliss is possibly the word for her. But she's not deeply offensive as some of the other characters are. But the satirical take of this in Here We Are is that, as in the films, the discreet charm of the bourgeoisie is a beautifully satirical title because these people are horrible, and their discreet charm is invisible. It's so discreet as to be... Funny enough, I believe there's a translational thing here, but discret in France can also mean secret. And if you look at it as the secret charm of the bourgeoisie, then it suddenly becomes a lot easier to understand, because it's such a bloody secret, you can't see it. In the film, they're contemporary 60s or 70s people, but very sneery, what we would recognise as upper middle class people, and they're very down on the working class.
I remember you saying when we watched the film, God, they're very miserable.
Yeah, they weren't happy people.
No.
It's interesting, isn't it, that in Here We Are, it's been made utterly contemporary. It's set now, in 2023, and that...
I've never been... I don't... Well, I don't know.
Well, that's interesting.
It's definitely now-ish, but they're cloning... They're talking about cloning dogs. It could be like 10 years from now. It feels like it's in an alternate kind of now.
It's certainly not set in the 60s and 70s. I read it as being now, and I thought this is going to be quite a difficult mapping of those characters from the films onto the stage version. But the stage version, it's set in, let's call it modern New York.
Yeah.
The class structure in America is a bit more money-based, but these people are the same in the sense they're not very nice. They are horrid people, actually. There's a certain amount of, we're so cultured because we've got money, and there's a whole song that Marianne sings about a room full of books. I like the shine of the leather-bound books rather than ever wanting to read them.
Yeah. There's
a marvellous set of books by Anthony Pohl called The Dance to the Music of Time. It's 12 volumes. I love it. It's a chronicle of the 20th century in Britain. It's a brilliant read for anyone. I would recommend it. But there's one book called Books Do Furnish a Room. And of course you can read that in two ways, i.e. the books and the ideas can furnish your life, or you can make your room look better by having books which you never open. Anyway, do you consider it contemporaneous? Or
I would stop at saying I think it's set in it's a modern day show, but I wouldn't say it's set in 2023 or this decade. I just think there are things that don't feel like they are intentionally trying to place us in the here and now, like dogs being cloned, or going to a restaurant. Sure, I know there's a sense of absurdity to it, but going to a restaurant where food can be engineered in such a way to taste like other things. That might be within the realms of possibility, but I think it's
very Willy Wonka, isn't it?
I think that's a great example, because I don't think Charlie and the Chocolate Factory isn't necessarily set in the year that it was written. There's a sense of like it's
any
slightly
time, any
alternate.
place.
It's ditto with Anyone Can Whistle. It's set kind of now, but it's not
now, but at one step removed.
Yeah.
Yes. Do you know? I think that's possibly a good. Because also, the more I think about it, in the biggest difference I think from Here We Are to the films is particularly in Act 2, where there's another character, and once again this is a spoiler, but the butler character turns out to be a bigwig in the anarchist movement, which is trying to destroy the world. And there is a sense that there's some kind of violent revolution going on outside of the embassy where they're trapped.
Mm-hmm.
They're not trapped by the revolution, they're trapped by something else, and we don't ever quite work that out. And it's the same force, around speech marks, that we see in the film, or become aware of in the film. But, I mean, we'll talk about Windsor, the character, in a minute, also known as Inferno. That's his sort of code name. Actually, there's quite a lot of references to codes, because there's also drug dealing going on with a very poor code going on. And codes, of course, are masks. They are ways of shielding truth.
I think there's a lot of the examination of the breakdown of language in this.
Yes, but also symbolically, using a mask or a code is a step away from reality, and we're seeing that in the piece as well, which I think actually takes us further to what you were saying about when it might be set. It's just this now contemporary, but one step removed.
Yeah.
Yes, I like that connection.
There's no acknowledgement of the COVID pandemic in the musical,
no.
So that I would not call it
now.
Yeah.
I'm going to rejoin a point I started a while ago, and then we've gone off into this lovely tangent about timings and reality. Marianne sings this song at the beginning of Act 1 about what a beautiful day it is. It's a perfect day. And at one point, she turns to her incredibly rich husband and says, "Buy this day for me." And I was immediately transported into Who Will Buy This Beautiful Morning, or whatever it's called, from Oliver by Lionel Bart, which could not be more different.
Yeah.
And yet, interestingly, there's that, I was reminded of it. It feels like a cynical take, because this woman is willfully ignoring the unpleasant things in life, whereas actually in Oliver, they're trying to escape the unpleasant things in life in a slightly different way.
Sure.
They're at the bottom of the heap, trying to emerge into a better world, the sunny uplands, as they say, whereas in this, they're on the sunny uplands and they don't want to look at the cost of it. So, there are different points in the hierarchy, the social hierarchy. And then there's a song in later on in Act 1, which is another inversion song, as far as I'm concerned, from Sondheim, but this time inverting one of his own songs, set in a French bistro. Do you want to briefly explain the conceit of this bistro?
This is the song that the Tracy Bennett character sings. So the concept of the restaurant is that it was previously French deconstructivist, so nothing is what it seems on the menu, but
the beef would taste of lamb.
Sure. But now it's post-deconstructivist, so everything on the menu is what it is on the menu, and the kind of what would you call it? The waitress, the taking the orders, is sobbing through this song, and again I think again undermining a trope of musicals where when Leo asks his friends, "Do we know what we want to order?" and then she starts screaming, "Do we know what we want? Does anyone know what we want?" And if you've been in a room where people are trying to write musicals, the thing they always bang on about is you need a character with a central want that goes about and achieves their want. And here we are in a restaurant where nobody knows what they want to order. Lo and behold, this has an additional meaning. There's a funeral going on behind the
curtains of the restaurant.
Sure. It turns out the proprietor of the restaurant has died, and the Tracy Bennett character is completely inconsolable about it, and in a kind of French Edith Piaf way says it is what it is. I just think it's an incredibly concise way of wrapping up several different meanings to a scene.
It's bleak and funny and nihilistic, whilst also being plot perfect for the obvious point of the scene, as well as the obvious and non-obvious themes of the piece.
Cleverly done.
It's one of the songs that does the heaviest lifting, I think, in the whole piece. So I think you've hit the nail on the head there. It's a great song. My tiny little observation about it is that, of course, there is already in the Sondheim canon a funny food list song. which is Have a Little Priest from
Sure.
Sweeney Todd, where all the food is not what it seems, which is exactly what the bistro historically was doing, but now isn't doing. So all the food is exactly what it seems. So it's the reverse of The Little Priest at
Sure.
one level. So we were talking earlier about the whether sometimes pastiching himself. I don't think he is, but I think it's nice to hear him developing variations on the same and the inverse theme. It's almost like, well, you'll be aware, of course, the most famous inversion in the whole of musical theatre must be from Tick Tick Boom by Jonathan Larson, which is the Sunday morning song, which is basically sometimes a song from Sunday in the Park with George, upside down. It's an inversion, more or less.
Sure, yeah.
It's interesting to hear Sondheim perhaps doing something similar to his own work.
I think Sondheim, if there is a style, is to always add an additional meaning to a song. I don't think a song is always just going to speak on its own terms. I think there's going to be something else going
layers
on.
upon layers. Like a good Victoria sponge.
Yes. Or an onion.
I wouldn't necessarily put the two together, or if you do choose to do so, I'm not having birthday cakes in your house. Let's talk about the score then a little bit more. And then I think the absence of the score. The first act is fully musicalised, but in a very lean and sparse kind of a way. And I think the songs really burnish Act 1. I think Sondheim's on cracking form, actually, to be honest. It sounds like good Sondheim, which serves the plot. When does Sondheim not serve the plot? I'm not suggesting that's happened, but it does what it needs to do. It doesn't outstay its welcome. I think, funnily enough, you go into Act 2 and you get the two songs in Act 2 are great songs, but the last song we hear is a particularly good song. I think it's longer than you think it's going to be. It started coming to an end, and I thought, oh, this is the end of the Sondheim canon. I was getting a little bit poignant about it.
Sure.
And then the song sort of continues on just a little bit like it's like
quite
he's
fragmentary.
It is, but it's like, and this is obviously meta on top of the script, which is also relatively meta anyway. On top of the script, there is the knowledge that Sondheim's career finishes here. The song starts to come to its end, having been a good song in its own right. It's Marianne again, funnily enough.
She is some kind of main character.
She really is.
I think she changes. Sorry, I'm changing topic, but I think of all the characters, she does change by the end of the show.
She and the bishop have the biggest change, but I think the bishop has less far to travel.
Yeah.
And he's also in it for less. But she sings this song, it sort of comes to an end, and I'm thinking, oh, it's a lovely song. What a beautiful song to end on. And then it just sort of continues a little bit longer than you think it's going to. And it's like Sondheim has built his own encore. That's how I sort of felt. It serves the plot, it's not self-indulgent,
no.
But it's like, oh, it's a song with two halves, or it's a song with an extra third, or something. Just got an extra, perfectly legitimate, perfectly justified extra bit. And I was delighted by that. And I love that song. Also, can we just briefly say, there's a song called No Marianne, isn't there?
There is.
From a incomplete version of... Oh,
God,
crikey!
Testing me now.
Isn't it? It was actually, the story was then turned into a musical by someone else, because she's a female chimney sweep, isn't she?
Don't know.
Oh, right. And I'm trying to remember.
But I know it's on the Unsung Sondheim album.
It is. Da 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 da. No, Marianne. I know Marianne and Marianne are quite the same, but you've got something from the early knockings of his career to the very last knockings. There's a lovely circularity in that.
There is.
Probably coincidental, but you never can tell.
Too late to ask now.
Well, yes, quite. Well, he might have written it down. But I really like that song, and it was a beautiful, fitting ending.
Even with the bear dance in the middle of it.
Yeah, I don't see a problem with that.
Oh.
I mean, you're right. There was. I mean, it's unusual. But the song is so much more than that.
Totally.
I mean, she's very difficult to read in that.
Totally.
Yeah. I mean, you can never work out whether she's daffy to the point of...
profoundness, or profound to the point
Yeah,
of...
is she profound, or is she... Sorry, forgive me, I have to say mentally subnormal. She's slightly simple, to use the old terms. But she's not. I think she's willfully blind, but also... As you say, she has a journey over the course of the piece. She's an interesting character, and yes, she's the heart of the piece, oddly. In a group of characters who aren't very likeable.
She is, as she says, searching for something she was trying to remember to do, and she spends the whole musical trying to figure it out. It's not like she's not sure, she's willfully ignorant, but maybe that's because she's so het up on what she's trying to figure out.
Possibly,
what is this thing?
yeah.
I don't know.
She's not an unpleasant character. I really like the bishop, played by David Hyde Pierce.
Yeah.
I'm going to make this observation, I made it to you. I think he's sort of oddly playing it like Kelsey Grammer, his fictional brother in Frasier. It feels much more like Frasier than it does Niles. Obviously, David Hyde Pierce is a great actor and has played lots of different characters, and he was in Curtains, so he knows what he's doing. So I'm not suggesting that it's because he's narrow. I'm just saying this looks... It's almost like I'm thinking, I'm going to do this the way Kelsey Grammer would play this vicar.
Yeah. I mean, I've always found it hard... in a Broadway or American audience that they clap an actor when they walk on stage, and if you're going into it believing that actually you're seeing the character on stage, why are you clapping the character? Yeah. That has always rubbed me the wrong way, and I don't understand how an American audience can believe a character when they think it's the actor. But that's by the by.
You do occasionally see it in Britain. When Angela Lansbury was doing...
That's the exception,
yeah.
Blithe Spirit, yeah.
Yeah, because it was a lap of honour for her.
In honesty, I thought I was seeing Angela Lansbury on stage. I didn't think I was watching her be Madame Arcati. But
yeah, and I suspect...
I find it so distancing.
But I bet Penelope Keith didn't get that when she was playing Madame Arcati a few years before that. Not because she's not a much-loved character, but she hadn't been in America for a career. You know, it wasn't a return to the London stage for her. It's an interesting point. I've been to see Crazy for You 3 times so far. Charlie Stemp got a clap on one of those occasions.
Did he?
And I thought that was quite interesting. But then again, also Charlie Stemp, in British terms, is the British Fred Astaire at the moment, and has a very particular place in the British show business firmament. There's no one else quite doing what Charlie Stemp does. He's not one of several. He is the Charlie Stemp, who is the only person able to do that kind of... Well, it's not the only person. There are plenty of people who can do it. He's the only one who's a name who can do it, and does it brilliantly. And I think there are occasions when a British audience will clap a person. But I agree with what you're saying. The Americans are much more gung-ho in their emotional responses. You know, I'm a stuffed shirt. I'm not going to pretend I'm not. I clench and clench and clench. And if I'm feeling really delighted, I'll just clench a little less. But we were talking about Marianne, and I want to talk about the bishop. Sorry.
Sure.
I really like the bishop. It's interesting because, you know, the character, the bishop who's looking for a job and actually wants to be a gardener, turns up in The Discreet Charm of the Bourgeoisie. He's in that film. Funny enough, he only really sort of turns up in the stage play when we're about to go into the exterminating angel part, which that character doesn't appear in. But that's not a problem. I think he's a really
bit of a non sequitur, but it's great.
Yeah, but he's a great character, and also I think he's also one of the most likeable characters, because he's sort of he comes in very honestly saying, the reason I'm looking for jobs is because I'm a terrible bishop. I don't really believe in God, is basically the message here. But he just encapsulates what a lot of people in the audience...
I love church, but I don't just mean the clothes.
Yeah, it's a great line, isn't it? Yeah, I'm here for the camp, darling. But also, he's a man actually who's having a crisis of faith, or didn't have faith, sees the benefit of having faith without being able to have the faith. If you take that position, some people do. I know a lot of people who are in no way religious but love the trappings, which is what this character is, and he has a journey, oddly. They have a really weird existential experience, and oddly it takes him closer to God. It's a very easy to understand journey, his character, but actually nowhere in that piece is he a ratbag, whereas almost all the other characters are ratbags. He's oddly the most...
No, you're right.
I think he's honest and moral. And I don't see that in almost any of the other characters. Well, yes, I don't want to draw the bigger conclusion about whether or not he's sure.
Given Wells' associations or thoughts of the church anyway.
Yeah. Well, let's just say it's a big organisation. All the churches are big organisations. Yes,
broad church.
A broad church. And there's a lovely joke as well when they manage to... they need to break the water main, and the maid uses the bishop's mitre to smite, Lovely visual joke that, and they don't even make anything of it. It's just that is the tool they use to bash the water out, and you think, and of course that reminds you of Anyone Can Whistle.
Yeah.
It's that's a miracle. What are the pieces in the score that you particularly respond to?
There are bits of incidental. I mean, I feel there is a moment in Act 2 where a song is
missing,
demanded of, and there is some incidental music that happens. I find that scene quite hard to watch because I think it feels painfully obvious, or maybe the wrong words, but I think I find it quite poignant, that moment, because you go, there is a gap here, and you can almost imagine what the song is going to be.
Oh yeah, because
the scene, I think itself, is really redeeming.
I think we should say what it is.
Sure, I'll let you.
Oh no, please.
It's a scene between Marianne and the bishop,
who we've established are the two nicest characters.
It's Marianne's birthday, or so she thinks, and I think it leads up to what I think the whole show might be about, which I think is different to what the two Buñuel films are about. Whereas I think the Buñuel films are kind of about class and kind of about organisations, or how we're stratified in society. I think here we are, although it has those themes, it's kind of about what do you do whilst you're alive.
That emptiness, isn't it?
And is being a wealthy person with no morals, is that a legitimate way? The answer is kind of any way is the legitimate way to live. Is murdering someone, that's another spoiler, is that a way to live your life? Is being a revolutionary a way to live your life? And the scene between Marianne and the bishop is, well, she's asking of him, why are we here? Whilst they're trapped in the room. Again, a great moment to answer that question. And he rather, I think I love the self-doubt in him as well, with levels of uncertainty. He says, well, this is what life could be, or it might not be. This happens, or it might not happen.
It's all very couched, isn't it?
Sure.
But of course that is the point too.
Yeah. And I guess they ruminate on ways of living. And I think whereas I had previously thought Square One was a better title, I think Here We Are sums up that scene, and therefore the rest of the show, the point of the show, much more concretely. And all of the characters, maybe barring, but no, not all of the characters to some degree are hypocrites. But again, that's a way one can live one's life.
And indeed, even with the best will in the world, the best of us are still hypocrites at some level.
Sure. Or we contradict ourselves, or we make mistakes.
We're not consistent quite.
And to fast forward to the end of the show, in spite of all that happens, they still decide they were going to go for another meal, even as they're being stopped by the sound of the world ending or the world crumbling around them. They have this unending desire, unabating desire to go and find food. So I think that scene sums up the point of the show, and again, it's aching for a song at that point, I think.
I mean, there is a very brutal approach to that as well. It's a hunger for life, the hunger that they're displaying, because the whole film is about them eating or wanting to find food to eat. I mean, and what do you do when there isn't any food? Either because the service isn't there to give you the food, or you're trapped in a room and you can't get food. So that hunger is there. There's a hunger for living, but we see this in the animal kingdom. What is the purpose of being a bird? I don't know, but birds, like all animals, live to eat and eat to live.
Yeah.
And there is an argument, there isn't much more than that. And actually, if this film says that there isn't much to life, and you just, what it is, it's what you make it, and there's no wrong answers or no right answers, then actually that brutal diurnal round, the brutality of it, and I use brutal in the sense of talking of brutes, the animals as brutes in that sort of Victorian sense of an animal, where the word brute comes from. I think it's interesting that you can boil it right down to that. The pointlessness of existence. And funnily enough, the bishop talks about that quite overtly when he arrives. Actually, none of us mean anything. And that's a big shock because you're hearing it from a bishop. But he's such an honest, I don't quite believe kind of bishop. And played by such a jolly character.
Yeah.
David Hyde Pierce gives him a sense of humour. He's the one who plays the piano, for goodness sake. He's all quite pleasant there. But that conversation, you're right, the missing song, let's call it, it's got incidental music as well, which really just means that what we're hearing
rubbing
is
salt into the wound.
Well, yeah, but yeah, I think that's true.
Hearing the music, we're hearing some kind of script. Which
we're
we know
hearing a prose song. Yeah, that's what we're hearing. It's really interesting. Yeah, I agree with you. And I remember you saying this when you came back from New York. I remember you saying, "Oh, there's this moment in Act 2 where you feel there should be a song and it doesn't happen." And when I saw the films, I was trying to work out, what could that be? What could that be? Where could that be? And you're right, Act 2 of the piece deviates from the film sufficiently, but we're on a different path at this stage. And without giving anything away, because that scene is pivotal, and it's all, it's so... What it is, it's important without being pretentious, which is a word we've used already, or portentous.
Yeah.
It is just... In fact, it's almost, I'm going to say thrown away. It isn't thrown away at all. It is made the stronger by, but it seems like it's being thrown away because she's not quite sure of the question and he's not quite sure of the answer. And they improvise both, and it turns out to be about right as far as it can be, and gives us, the audience, something to hook ourselves onto. It may not be what the story's about, but it's a pretty good hook.
I think it makes it all the more touching.
It's touching. That's a very nice... And they're the two nicest characters, which also helps with our sympathy and our empathy.
Some sentimentality.
Up to a point, Lord Copper, up to a point. But also, I really like the fact that he as the bishop, is slightly fumbling.
Yeah.
He's not giving us gospel. He's giving us his observations based on his understanding of real life. But also, I love the fact that actually it does that very simple trick. There are 3 words, here we are. And it puts a bit of emphasis on here, we are. And it puts the emphasis on here, we are. And it also puts the emphasis on here, we are. It addresses each of the 3 somehow in the course of that. Those would be the 3 verses of the song if it was written.
Sure.
Here, and we, and are, as in exist.
Yeah.
You put those together. It feels... You're right. It does feel like a missing song. And there's almost a sense at the end where a song is reprised and you think, oh, we've got a finale. And it isn't quite a finale. And if we're going back to poignancy and Sondheim having left the building, as it were,
yep.
Shortly after the last song, when the science fiction element of the exterminating angel, which is them trapped in this dining room essentially, starts to really kick in and weird things begin to happen, the first thing we're told is that piano has stopped working.
Piano has died.
The piano has died. And that is the passing of Sondheim, isn't it? I'd love to know if that was added as a kind of extra flavour upon his death, or whether it was always written in there. But it's interesting, the piano stops when the music does.
But it's interesting how in both of the films there are pianos.
Yes.
And how in the Exterminating Angel, when the supernatural element takes hold, the piano isn't played.
That's right.
Until it's used as the key for unlocking the...
Yeah, well, pianos have keys, so
it might not be exclusively that,
yeah.
But there is that element to it. So I guess it does bring us to, is it an unfinished piece? Because
Tell me, Mr. Schubert.
We're talking about it as if it's unfinished.
But it isn't.
How do we take it?
Well,
Because I think then our critics are bound to say, well, if we feel there's a moment here that's lacking, it's therefore not working in that moment, or living up to our expectations, or doing what we think it should be doing.
Living up to our expectations has 2 different meanings, though. Living up to our expectations because we need the piece to do it, because that's something missing, and it hasn't done that. That is an argument. But are we falling into a trap of saying, musicals do this, this claims to be a musical, it's doing something different, therefore it's not a musical? I have no truck with that position. It's, why couldn't a musical just have music in Act 1 or a bit of Act 2, or one have one song? Musical talk, we take a very broad view. We've had to address this question just sort of, what do we discuss? And I always say musical film, musical theatre, cabaret and pantomime. But when it comes to musical theatre, I absolutely include plays with music. A play with 1 song, a play with 5 songs, a play with 3 songs, a play with 28 songs. but isn't a musical per se, but is a musical, clearly. It's musical theatre in the broadest sense of theatre with music. You know, Sondheim is the great doyen of Broadway in many ways. You know, he's a legend. And his shows, whilst they weren't always popular and weren't always commercial at the beginning, he's always been known. And even his failures, you know, he's like, Woody Allen had the same reputation for a bit in cinema. He wrote heroic failures. And of course they weren't failures at all, they just weren't necessarily commercial at the time. They've subsequently become very much so. But are we saying that a Sondheim by musical has to follow this convention? Song at the beginning, song at the end of Act 1, song at the beginning of Act 2, song at the end of Act 3, end of Act 2, lots of songs in the middle. If it deviates from that, is it a failure? No, it's just doing something different. This show is also, we've said, absurdist, not following narrative forms. And if it's not following a narrative form in its linear storytelling, because it's not a linear storytelling, why should it do the same musically as a musical? Why should it fit the form? Why should there be a formula? So it kicks the formula out, perfectly happy with that. But we have also said there's at least one, and I think it's only one place in Act 2 where I thought, I mean, you could put more songs in, and I certainly saw other points.
Sure.
And you and I were talking about, you know, leitmotifs representing the, let's call it the supernatural force that stops them leaving the room, and how you could play with that in different points, and how you could put that in a finale if you were ever doing that. You know, you and I were talking, we were musically dramaturging what we would do if we were writing this.
There are monologues directed to the audience at the end that needn't be monologue. I mean, they could be monologues. They could stay. It could stay as it is.
So I think it's a really interesting question you've raised there. I would say the piece works, and because the piece works in its form, it's not a failure. So it's not an unfinished piece. Could it be more finished? Or a better question is, could it have been done differently? Yes. If Sondheim had chosen to, and had lived long enough, to entirely musicalise Act 2, I probably would have slightly preferred Act 2. I slightly enjoyed Act 1 over Act 2, partly because it has music all the way through, and I think the music really enhances what the story's doing, and therefore, whilst it's in no way a failure, I think it just misses those extra things which make it brilliant. It's not quite brilliant. Act 2. It's great. It's not quite brilliant. It might have been brilliant with Sondheim's music making what they've got, which is very good, better. I think is my take, but it's not a failure. It's not unfinished. It is a very distinct, very unusual thing. What's your view?
I'm inclined to agree, and I think on the subject of things being unfinished, Edward Albee is right when he says works aren't finished, they're abandoned. And I think all work to a degree is... I look back on work I've submitted for degrees that was deemed finished, I'm using air quotes there. I look back on it and go, I could have changed this word, I didn't mean that, there's a typo there. Things are full of mistakes. I think... And maybe it's the fact that he's died, we're trying to put an air of finality on the whole thing. This is the last will and testament. But he changed Follies a decade after he'd written it. He added songs to The Frogs when it went to Broadway. He added songs to Saturday Night when it got its big proper production. I think it's always going to be tinkered around with.
It's big proper production. Do you mind? I was at the Bridewell when it had its world premiere. Thank you very much indeed. I was very, very proud to have been there. That's my Sondheim moment.
Yes, I think...
And Tracy Bennett was in that too, by the way.
She was. We've come full square then. Yeah, I think my piece is that I think it's finished in the sense that all work is finished in an unfinished sense.
But let me ask you this question. What, when they're rifling through Stephen Sondheim's trunks, and it sounds a terrible image, but you get the idea, they come across a, not complete, but a fairly sketched out version of the song for the scene that we think would have been enhanced by having that song. And if Jonathan Tunick or whoever said, yes, we could probably work that into something, and David Ives and the director said, yes, that would work. You know, if there was general consensus of putting it in, this is such a figurative position, so it's hypothetical, so there's no wrong or right answers here, but should it be left as it is, or could that be done?
should that
Sure,
be done?
why
is the question.
not?
Yeah.
You have a 2023 version of Here We Are. You have a 2026 version of
Absolutely,
Here We Are.
yeah.
And it's like films being remade. Which is your version? Which is your favourite West Side Story? Or,
I agree with you. I'm going to even mention Radical. I've got to, because I like to mention it every 12 minutes. But, there's more than
You've
one.
done very well.
But there's one.
Really clenching.
I unclench when Radical enters the room. But seriously, there's two performing versions of Radical, essentially. If that's all the way back to Gilbert and Sullivan, then, that's a pretty good pedigree. So I agree with you, you and I have had plenty of conversations off the record about how we'd really love to see Wise Guys or even Bounce produce perhaps more than Roadshow. And actually one day, will we ever get to see a version of Bounce on stage? Will we ever get to see Wise Guys on stage? And would they be different shows to Roadshow?
Yeah.
Are there two fully written Stephen Sondheim shows waiting to, ironically, go on the road?
But I think that's definitely a conversation for another time on whether... to what level does a definitive version of something, an artistic definitive version of something, hold the cards?
And who owns it to make those decisions?
Obvious example being the work of Shakespeare and how it's constantly pulled around now, but that does nothing to diminish the text of Shakespeare, or does nothing to diminish the reinvention of the Shakespeare.
You can't do it wrong. You can do it badly, and you can do it well. You can't do it wrong.
Yeah. Yes. So I think
which is the sign of a legend, actually. Let's make this more accurate. Is the sign of a genius. And actually, I fear that we have to make the same parallel with Stephen Sondheim. This isn't supposed to be an obituary for Stephen Sondheim, but at one level it can't help but be. And like him or not like him, or like bits of him, there is no one like Stephen Sondheim. There will be no one like Stephen Sondheim. I'm sorry to say, actually. But I'm so glad that we had Stephen Sondheim.
Yeah, me too.
Well, Colm, thank you very much indeed. We've been through this absurdist conversation, and here we are. And there you go, which would be a marvellous sequel.
Off your pop.
Yeah, and off your pop, the third in the trilogy. But seriously, thank you so much, and thank you for sharing your views and knowledge and enthusiasm, A, for Stephen Sondheim, but B, for Here We Are. It was so lovely to see your enthusiasm before you went to Broadway to see it, and then to hear all about it. You have delivered Stephen Sondheim and Here We Are to me in London, and I've got to wait for it to come to London. So, I can't thank you enough. It's been a privilege talking about it with you.
It's been my displeasure.
Musical Talk. And there we are, talking about Here We Are. Just one letter difference. And I found that conversation with Colm to be absolutely fascinating when we were having it. It was so wonderful to be able to talk to him about a show that he had seen in New York twice. And as I said at the beginning of this episode, I do hope that those of us who live somewhere else in the world, in my case London, but other places also exist, I've been led to believe, will get a chance to see this show in other productions. May it come to London soon. And as we've already pondered, there is a question as to whether this will be the last new Sondheim show. Who knows what's sitting in the Stephen Sondheim archive? And as Colm has observed, we have a few possibilities sitting in plain sight. I'd certainly like to see Wise Guys and Bounce, even though they are sort of the same show, but they're sort of not. And they're sort of not Roadshow, which is obviously what those two shows ultimately morphed into. But for me, Here We Are is an interesting coda to an incredible career. But the show that it most reminds me of in the Stephen Sondheim catalogue is a show from the beginning of Stephen Sondheim's illustrious period of work. And that is Anyone Can Whistle. And you might say, well, they're completely different. But hear me out. Anyone Can Whistle is an absurdist comedy, in this case by Arthur Lawrence. And any way you cut it, the plot really sort of doesn't hang together. And that's the general view 50 years later. But it's a great score, the plot holds together enough for it to make sense, and it's continually being revisited and revived. So it has something. It's got a hook. There's an enigma attached to it. And I think we're still waiting for the definitive version. Here We Are is at the other end of Stephen Sondheim's career, and yet it's based on an absurdist plot. And it hasn't been an enormous success in the same way that Anyone Can Whistle was an actual failure, famously closing after only a few days. Here We Are has done better than that, but a 4-month run doesn't seem that long for a Sondheim show, even off-Broadway, which is what The Shed is. And like Anyone Can Whistle, it's set in a world which is our world, but maybe a couple of degrees off-kilter, skewed, for satirical intent, for both shows are terribly satirical. So my prediction is that Here We Are is going to be like Anyone Can Whistle. It will probably never take its place amongst a pantheon of great Sondheim shows, but it will never be forgotten. It will always be revived, re-explored, re-examined, and, I think, re-enjoyed. And that is a fabulous legacy for any show. Well, that, I think, brings this episode of Musical Talk to an end. I do hope you've enjoyed it, and I do hope that you'll feel able to join us again next week, or whenever, for another episode of Musical Talk where we'll be talking about something completely different. So until then, let me offer you a traditional synonym for farewell, and we'll call it a day. Here goes. Goodbye. This episode of Musical Talk presented by Colm Malloy and Thos Ribbits and edited by Thos Ribbits. Copyright Musical Talk 2024. To find out more about the world of Musical Talk and listen to past episodes, go along to our website www.musicaltalk.co.uk or subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and follow us on the usual social media networks like Facebook, Instagram and X, formerly known as Twitter. And if you want to follow me on the latter, you can. At Musical Talk Thos. Right, I'm just going to plot that there. I want to make sure that you're not blocked.
Bit lard face. Squiggle muffin.
These are the
legs.
I said the rejected dwarfs from Snow White, aren't they? There's no
bit humper. Slug wafter.
Goodness, man. There's no list of songs in here, are there?
Nope.
Oh, that's a great pity. Never mind.
But it does say Act 1, the road, Act 2, the room. I don't know if you spotted that.
Oh, no, I didn't spot that. Well, that makes sense. Ready?
Whenever you are.
Happy for me to lead?
Go for it.
Are you sure?
Yes.
Yeah. Actually, give me a level.
Turnip head. Well,
you're not going to be speaking at that volume, no?
Turnip head. Turnip head.
Good.
Head turnip. Head of turnip.
Yes, I'm just the deputy head of turnip. Right.
And the thrust of the article is that they had presented a dramaturgical concession in the plot to Sondheim, who effectively wrote off the work he had done and said, I'm happy for this to go ahead.
Signed off.
He signed off the work he had done up until that point.
Because it's quite interesting to me. When I saw it in the Brunel film...
Boonwell.
Pardon?
Boonwell.
Boonwell. Sorry, what did I say?
Brunel.
Oh, I'm calling him... Yeah, sorry.
Isambard.
Yeah. When I saw it...
Sorry.
No, thank you for correcting me. I don't want to put that in at all.
Redact that, Thos.
Yeah.
Future Thos.